Holly Cummins. Oh, I'm so sorry. It's not even been a long day. I'm here with Holly Cummins. I'm looking at the wrong camera now. God.
Well, you see, this is awesome because one of the things we were going to talk about is the importance of sleep. And
I think we've proved the importance of sleep. Sleeping is really important. Otherwise, your productivity goes into the toilet.
yeah, and you make mistakes that you think you're being more productive, you think you're squeezing more in, but actually the quality of what you're doing is so low that you end up calling your guests the wrong name, and really.
I'm so glad that it's you I called the wrong name to, but it's because I got cocky, because when there's someone else new who I don't know, and if they've got a name which is not an English name, then I'm really careful about the pronunciation. But no, it's Holly, it's fine. But I had to say your surname, and I never say your surname. So we were going to talk about stuff. We just did a joint presentation about developer productivity and fun, and how they are actually the same thing, and how to try and sell it to your boss that it's a good idea to have fun and be productive. So I thought we would kick off our conversation around that. So I guess, what would you like to say about the topic?
I think that's sort of that selling it to your boss piece is really important, that a lot of us intuitively know we work better if we have more, well, selling it to your boss and selling it to yourself actually, because we intuitively know we work better if we have more sleep, we work better if we're happy, and yet we can sort of end up into this creepy situation where the to-do list is infinite and we bring more and more stuff on, and then we say, okay, well, I can achieve more if I work an extra hour, but it's never ending, because then it becomes I can achieve more if I work an extra 2 hours, and then it's like, what if I just don't sleep? And then you end up in the situation where you're effectively working drunk, except without the fun of the alcohol, and it's just not good. And so in fact, what you can do is you can kind of reverse that instead and say, actually, if I work in a more focused way, and if I do that self-care to give myself permission to stare into space, permission to knit during meetings, all of those things that look like you're not being productive, actually your outcomes are going to be better.
So I found that after I first had kids, and I have a very constrained amount of time to work in, and you can't work the extra hours, I got very, very efficient. I was able to get rid of a lot of toil and faff, and got very efficient, and I'd go quickly from one thing to the next to the next to the next. But my experience with that is, well, A, the more you do, the more people expect from you, and B, as we were talking about on our presentation, it's not enough to have the sleep and the gaps at the end of the day. You need gaps during the day to do the thinking and the parsing and the let things bubble up.
Yeah, I've heard that before actually, that people find that after having kids, all of a sudden their efficiency is so much higher, just because they don't have that elasticity in their schedule. And we sort of see this at sort of an organizational level too, because when companies move to a 4-day week, which seems like an absolutely ridiculous thing to do, your staff could work 5 days, or you could pay them the same and they work 4 days. Which would you choose as an organization? You go, the 5-day one, please. But actually, it's a similar thing, that because people know they need to fit things into that time, they manage their time much more effectively, they get more done, and then they come back so refreshed because they've had 3 days skiing in the Alps, or deep sea diving, or staring into space, or gardening, or whatever it is they do. And so then they, on Monday morning they're raring to go again.
And I think as well, it makes you think, like you said, think more carefully about what you put in those times. So for example, meetings, if you only have 4 days to have meetings, you're suddenly like, I don't really want meetings on all 4 of those days. Do we need this meeting every week? Do we need this meeting every day? Or can we just and one of the ways I schedule or plan my time, it kind of worked out accidentally, but Tuesdays and Thursdays tend not to have meetings on, and now I'm quite protective of those days. I don't want any meetings, because I need the flow time and I need the thinking time.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of people say that about meetings, that it's not just the time of the meeting, it's the time around the meeting, because the meeting's coming. As you say, well, there's no point starting something that needs deep thought because I've got a meeting. And then afterwards you're like, okay, well, I need to think about that meeting and just recover from the trauma of talking to other people, so I can't do deep thought things, and then it ends up taking all of the time. And I think then you can sort of get sucked into this pattern where you just sort of do the easy things, the non-important things, because there's always something else to do, something else coming, and that's just not then going to get you where you need to go in terms of making those bigger changes that are good for you and good for your team.
I was having a conversation with someone here at the conference, and they were talking about API design actually, and they were talking about how they thought something really clever and they implemented it, And then they tried it out as a user, and it turned out that they were not very happy with the it didn't really work the way they wanted it to, and they were not afraid to throw that away. And I think that there's two things I was thinking about that. One, I think that requires the space to sit back and think, why isn't it working? Like, it's not a technical thing. Technically it works, but from a user's point of view, this doesn't make sense to me. It feels clunky, it's weird. And also, you also have to not be afraid to be like, that's trash. Let's just throw it away. And I think that as an industry, we're bad at stepping back. We're bad at looking at things critically and going, do we really need it? And we're definitely bad at throwing stuff away.
Yeah, that throwing away metaphor, actually, I mean, it's not a metaphor, that was just... But
I think.
Yeah, but actually I think that works really well, because I think it's about how we measure our time and how we think about the value of our time.
Right.
And I think we tend to think every second is precious, and so I need to spend every second producing code, and then that code is precious. But actually, it's about stepping back and it's saying, it's not about, did I extract the maximum value from that second? It's, did I extract the maximum value from this week? Did I extract the maximum value from this year? And the way of doing that might end up meaning that you throw code away, and also that you throw time. Well, and when you throw code away like that, it's not a bad thing. What you've made is better at the end, even though there was this appearance of waste. And then with our time, it's the same thing. You think, well, I've just thrown this time away. I was stood staring into space. And it's like, no, you weren't stood staring into space. You were solving a problem that then allows you to have, some better solution.
We talk a lot about things like productivity and outcomes and outputs, and I think we tend to think of lines of code and things like that as the output. And so when we do delete things, we're like, oh my god, it's like the opposite of productivity. But in actual fact, it's definitely not the lines of code, it's the things you learned when you were doing that. So I always try and think about this, and it's true in things like DevRel as well, when we're doing content and writing and things. We quite often have to do stuff which is like, no, that's rubbish, we're not doing that. Or you've just got something which is half finished, but you haven't really figured it out, and so you have to be afraid to not let it go. It's all about what's going on up here. It's not about the lines of stuff that you write or don't write. And we get sucked into this trap of produce, whereas what you are producing is the learning and the experience. And if we would focus a bit more on that as an outcome of what we do as developers, I think that would really help shift our perception on a lot of these things.
And there's you can again connect it to pair programming as well, actually, because sometimes when people object to pair programming, there's this efficiency argument of like, why would I pay two developers to do, the work of one developer? But the limiting factor, well, there's two things. One is the limiting factor in good code is not the speed at which we could type. It's not like, oh, Trish, if you could type 400 words per minute, you'd produce, twice as much good code. But then also, the output of the pair programming session isn't just the slightly higher quality code, it's also the people. And hopefully both of those people come out smarter and cleverer and having shared knowledge, and that's something that is hard to quantify, which is why pair programming seems inefficient. But actually it's the most valuable thing, is that you've just been turning your junior developers into senior developers through the process of pair programming.
Yeah, and we were both at GoTo Copenhagen last week, and it was really good to be there with Daniel Tejas North, Martin Fowler, and Dave Farley, Simon Brown, all these great names, and a lot of them were talking about pair programming, TDD, all that classic stuff that I loved ages ago and I've stopped talking about for a while. But I've been thinking a lot about pair programming as a learning thing. Like you said, it's not about the producing lines of code. And Dave Farley always used to say, the keyboard is not the bottleneck. It is the thinking, it is the problem solving, and you can do that faster with two people. The other thing that I always remember with pair programming, people ask me, how did you get so competent with IntelliJ IDEA? And I'm like, I don't think I learned any of these tricks on my own. I watched other people do them, and I work with a lot of different developers. This one knows the debugger, and this one knows the editor, and this one, and you gather them all. And I honestly believe it's not possible to learn that without pairing, without seeing someone else do that.
Yeah.
So important to see someone in action.
Yeah, or it's so much slower, because you have to get to that kind of, you don't learn it passively, you really have to get to the breaking point. So the other day I was really frustrated because something I wanted to do in the IDE I couldn't, and I was like, oh, the design is wrong, and I got to the point where then I complained to a colleague, and they're like, no, it's just this. So I was like, oh. I see. But it was only until I actually got annoyed enough to go out and ask that I realized the problem was between keyboard and chair.
But that's the problem with a lot of these tools, like any sufficiently complicated tool, or even some not very complicated tools, the things are not discoverable. I was talking to someone about the debugger and saying, I was giving the talk at Coast Copenhagen, and they were like, drop frame is really helpful to reset yourself back and then go back into the code that you were debugging. And most people don't know that because you wouldn't Google, how do I drop frames? Like, what is that thing? I didn't even know that was a thing, So yeah, you need to pair with people who are more experienced who can help us get leveled up. There was something else you just said, I can't remember what it was. Oh yeah, things that we don't know and we get kind of bogged down with some of these things. And I wanted to talk about frog boiling.
Yes.
Because we learned something really interesting about frog boiling last week, didn't we?
Yeah, so we were at Go to Copenhagen, surrounded by these amazing luminaries, and what knowledge did I leave the conference with? I left the knowledge that frog boiling is a myth. What knowledge did you leave the conference with? The same knowledge, right? That's all we've learned. Well, no, it's not all we've learned.
Well, it was important because in our presentation we had a frog being boiled, and we had to change that. We were like, the frog will get out of the pot at some point.
Yeah.
But that works really nicely for us because then we're like, you don't have to, you can choose the point at which you exit the pot.
Yeah.
But yeah, mostly, I mean, all of the talks are fantastic, but mostly I learned that frogs don't let themselves be boiled.
Yeah, and we learned this from Kent Beck as well. So, it wasn't just some nobody who taught us this. It was, one of the great names in our industry, the great thinkers in our industry.
I mean, that's a great presentation about change and stuff, but mostly, and it was a throwaway comment in there about frogs.
Yeah.
That's what we learned.
Yeah, but now you all know too. Frog boiling is a myth.
I'm going to end the interview at that because I think that is the perfect point at which to leave the interview.
On the important things.
Frog boiling is a myth. You can get out of the pot when you want to. Thank you very much, Holly, for being my guest, and thank you for presenting with me because it's always a pleasure.
Oh, it was so much fun.